Welcome to the next episode of the Version Control with Git series. In this episode, we'll explore how to make files that Git doesn't track in a repository. And so let's take a look at where our repository is right now. We'll type pwd. We can see we're in the planets folder, which is our Git repository that we've been working with in this series. And if we type ls, we should see we have one file called mars.txt. And if we cat mars.txt to the screen, it has 3 lines in it. And if we type git log -- one line, we should see that we have 3 commits so far in our history. So here we're going to explore times when we don't want to track specific files with Git. And there are a few reasons you might not want to track files. Perhaps they're your raw data files. Raw data files are sometimes really big, and so it's unnecessary to put them in your repository. Also, raw data files typically aren't going to change, which is what we want to record in our history of the repository. So since they're not changing, we may not want to record their history in our repository. Another instance we may not want to add a file to our repository is if it's not a plain text file. And so Git is really good at telling us the difference and keeping track of changes to plain text files in a productive way. It's not as good at telling us the difference between the last version of a PNG file, an image file, and the current version of that PNG file. You can add those to your repository, but it keeps a full copy of it instead of tracking the changes between the two every time you do it. And so it's something to keep in mind. There are still times when I want to add files that are not text files into my Git repositories, but I need to be careful when I do it to making sure I'm thinking about the size of those files and knowing that I cannot compare using git diff the current version of it to the old version. If you try and git diff an image file, for example, it will tell you that it's a binary file and it can't tell the difference. And so that's something to keep in mind as you think about which files you want to ignore or actually have in your repository. Okay, in our example, we're going to create a series of data files and results files, and we don't want to keep track of either the data files or the results files in our repository. And so first we're going to make a directory in our folder in our repository called results.txt or results. And then we're going to create a bunch of data files and result outputs, and we're going to do that using the touch command, which makes a blank file in the Unix shell. We're going to touch a.dat, b.dat, c.dat, and then results a.out and results b.out. And so we have 3 data files, A, B, and C, and so far we only have 2 output files, A out and B out. And so let's type ls. We can see we have all of our data files in here, and then if we type ls results, we can see we have our output files. All right, if we type git status, we'll see where our repository currently is. It shows us that we have untracked files. It's seeing that we have files in our folder that haven't been tracked with Git, and it shows it to us in red. In theory, we could ignore this red and just be like, oh, data files, I don't want to see them. Oh, results folder, I don't want to see those. I don't want to add them to my Git. But Git provides us a convenient way to not have files listed here and not tell us about any changes that are made to them. So if we truly want Git to ignore our data files and results files, we can tell it to ignore them instead of us as humans having to ignore these red files that then I want to add to my repository. So don't accidentally add them. I can tell Git, I'm not tracking these files. And so to do so, we need to create a file called .gitignore. So Git looks for a file called .gitignore, and anything that's listed in that file, it ignores. So we're going to type nano.gitignore. And it's important you spell it right because it's looking for the correctly spelled name of the file. And then in here, I'm going to say, and we can actually use Unix shell wildcards here. We can say I want to ignore anything that ends in .dat, and I want to ignore anything that's in the results folder. And then I'll go ahead and save this and hit Control X, and then Y. Yes, I want to save it. I want to keep the same name, .gitignore, and I'll press Enter. And so now let's see what happens if I type git status. So it's no longer showing me about any of the data files that I said I wanted to ignore or the results folder, but it is showing me the git ignore file now. And so if I want it to also not try and track the git ignore, I could add the name git ignore to my git ignore file. So I could go in and nano git ignore and add a line that says .git ignore. That's a little meta, but I actually really like to keep track of the files that I'm ignoring in my Git repository. So if I get this repository on another computer sometime later, I can be like, oh, I had this ignoring all my data files. So on my other computer, I probably had those data files and I had a results folder. And so I like to know that. And so I'm going to add and commit my git ignore file here. So I'll say git add.git ignore. Oop, and I typed the name wrong. Git add.git ignore. Now it's staged, and so then I can commit it with git commit -m. I could say add the ignore file. Oops, ignore file. There we go. And I'll go ahead and run that. Now if I type git status, everything is up to date. I have in my history some information about which files I'm ignoring, and it's now ignoring any different files or any of the files that are data files or in my results folder. So what happens if I try and track one of those data files? So if I type git add a.dat, it says, hey, this is a file that's being ignored in your git ignore file. So if you really want to add it, you can add the -f flag, but otherwise it's a good warning message. And so I don't want to force it to do that. I intentionally added the a.dat to the ignore file. I just did this on accident. So I don't need to add a.dat to my repository. Thank you, Git, for telling me. If you want to keep track of which files are currently being ignored, you can type git status --ignored, and it's going to print out all the files that are ignored. You might also ask what happens if I add a new file that matches my pattern. So if I do touch results c.out, so I'm creating the output file for C, is it still ignored? So I'll type git status, and it is. So it's ignoring anything that matches those patterns in my git ignore. So even if I continue to make new files, it will continue to ignore them as long as they match the patterns in the file. This is the end of the ignoring files lesson. I will note that there are ways to make exceptions. So you could have a rule saying, I want to ignore all .dat files, and you can make an exception with saying !a.dat to say, I do want to track a.dat actually. So you can make exceptions in your ignore file as well. Please continue on to the next video to learn more and start using branches in Git.